Now, I'm going to go straight on. There is no time in hand. Time is very tight this afternoon. I know you'll understand why. The next item of business is a debate on motion 24322 in the name of Hamza Youssef on the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill at stage 3. Can I invite the members who wish to speak in the debate to press their to speak buttons now, or if they're remote, the R function. I now call Hamza Youssef, Cabinet Secretary, to speak and move the motion, please.
For the purposes of Rule 9.11 of the Standing Orders, I advise the Parliament that Her Majesty, having been informed of the purport of the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill, has consented to place her prerogative and interest insofar as they are affected by the bill at the disposal of the Parliament for the purposes of the bill. Presiding Officer, first of all, let me start by giving thanks. Many thanks to give, probably too many for this time allotted, but my thanks to the Scottish Government Bill team, who have put in a Herculean effort in relation to this bill. I want to thank them, my Special Advisor John McFarlane, who is known to many around here. I want to thank the parliamentary clerks, again, who have, I think, put in an equally Herculean effort in relation to this bill. The many stakeholders that we have collectively all engaged with, I've asked many of them for that engagement over weekends into evenings, and I thank them for giving that time. And my thanks, of course, to MSPs right across this chamber, both my own colleagues in my backbenches, in our backbenches, but also colleagues of the opposition who, in the main, absolutely have worked constructively in relation to this bill. And I would suggest that a Parliament that has been somewhat in receipt of criticism in recent weeks and months and denigrated by some, I would suggest that the Hate Crime Bill actually has shown how Parliament can work at its best. Because when we seek consensus, not for the sake of it, not for its own sake, but actually to strive, I would suggest, for an ideal that is far greater than us as individuals or indeed as political parties, then if we do that, and we can do that with if we do that as legislators, then we can create truly transformative law, but also law that protects the most vulnerable in our society, as hate crime does. Presiding Officer, I had a kind of carefully... yes, of course.
Elaine Smith.
Thank you very much for taking the intervention. I just wonder what you would say to the fact that in debating this hate crime bill, I'm now being accused of hate crime and perhaps could expect to have the police at my door.
Ms Smith.
You won't have the police at the door for anything...
Cabinet Secretary, sorry.
You won't have the police at the door for anything that you said in the hate crime bill, and I'm very sorry to hear that you were the victim of hate. I can promise you on Twitter, if you want to see hatred, you could look at my timeline any given day of the week. So I understand how pernicious hate crime can be. I had a carefully crafted speech, Presiding Officer, that I was going to use this morning, but actually I've somewhat changed it after the debate, and I thought a very good debate at stage 3. Yesterday, and I actually just wanted to share a personal anecdote to hopefully illustrate why I think the hate crime bill is needed. Not because my experience actually is unique. Actually, it's the very opposite. That they are the experiences of hundreds of thousands of our fellow Scots. And I apologise in advance, Deputy Presiding Officer, because some of the language I will use will be unparliamentary, but it is to illustrate the very point that I want to make. Presiding Officer, as a young child, I wasn't aware that the colour of my skin made me different to the majority of most Scots. That may seem unusual, but anybody who has, I think, young kids or young nephews or nieces, grandchildren, they'll understand that innocence. The first time I ever became aware of my race was in primary school, in primary 2, in fact. It was my best friend. He'd been my best friend in primary 1. He came up to me one day, completely out of the blue. We hadn't had a fight, we hadn't had a disagreement of any sort, and he said in a very matter-of-fact voice, "I can't be your friend anymore." And I remember feeling quite stunned. As I say, it came completely out of the blue. And of course, I asked him why. And he said to me, and I'll always remember it, he said, "Because you're a Paki." I had no idea what the word meant. I remember skulking around the playground, not really having a clue of what just happened. And I went back home after school and I asked my mum, "Am I a Paki?" I remember my mum being quite visibly upset. And she explained to me how some people, very rude people, she said, sometimes make fun of us because of the colour of our skin. But that I had done nothing wrong. And from 6 years old to the very present day, some 30 years, not a day goes by, Presiding Officer, but I'm not conscious of the colour of my skin. And I suspect the vast, overwhelming majority of my interactions, that the first thing people see or notice about me is the colour of my skin. And they probably form a judgment about me in relation to the colour of my skin, sometimes consciously, sometimes, I'm sure, unconsciously. I tell that story for 2 reasons, Presiding Officer. One is that my 6-year-old friend didn't become a racist. We don't have racist 6-year-olds, I don't believe. He undoubtedly learned that racism at home, probably from a parent or an older sibling. I mention that because there's some here who believe that if racism that is intentionally stirred up, using threatening or abusive language takes place at home with a sibling, child or grandchild present, or that they were the ones that hatred maybe was even directed towards, that should not be prosecuted. My contention is that the impact is exactly the same, regardless of where hatred is intentionally stirred up, or whoever is the target of that stirring up, whether that is at home or out with the home. The outcome could lead to a person of colour, a disabled person, someone who's gay or lesbian, an older person, trans women, somebody with variation in sex characteristics, getting beaten up, threatened with violence or rape. And do we think they care whether that hatred was intentionally stirred up or took place at home? The second reason I tell that story, Presiding Officer, is to illustrate how strong the safeguards in the bill are. Let's hypothecate probably what happened in relation to my 6-year-old friend. Why did he use the words that he used? The chances are my friend was probably at home, and back in the early 90s when this took place, he probably heard a parent say, "I'll go pick up a loaf and milk from the packy shop." But let's be honest, that was relatively common parlance in the 1980s and the 1990s. Now let's assume that same phraseology is used today in 2021, after this hate crime bill, hopefully, has passed stage 3. Even the use of that language, in that scenario by an older grandparent, whether at home or in public, that I suspect we probably all agree is racist, that would not be prosecuted under the hate crime bill, under the new stirring up of hatred offences, or indeed under the previous racial stirring up of hatred offence. Why? Because the threshold of offences is so incredibly high. So to those who think they may accidentally somehow fall foul of the law in relation to even Elaine Smith's point, because they believe sex is immutable, or they state an adult man cannot become a female, or they campaign for the rights of Palestinians, as Sandra White mentioned to me yesterday, or those who proselytise that same-sex relationships are sinful, none of these people would fall foul of the stirring up of hatred offence for solely stating their belief, even if they did so in a robust manner. Why? Because solely stating any belief, which I accept may be offensive to some, is not breaching the criminal threshold. Through the legislative process, we have created offences that have a high threshold of prosecution, rightly so. I just want to check, Presiding Officer, how much time I have left.
Give you an extra minute for taking intervention.
Thank you for that. So the safeguards of the bill, I think, are so important to recognise. And there are really strong safeguards in this bill. A necessary element of the new stirring up of hatred offence is that they now require an intention to stir up hatred. This safeguards freedom of expression, making clear in the face of the bill that there is an objective test that safeguards freedom of expression. The availability of a reasonableness defence safeguards freedom of expression, requiring each element of the stirring up of hatred to be proven beyond reasonable doubt with corroborated evidence safeguards freedom of expression. And at stage 3, amendments have introduced a new freedom of expression provision for all characteristics except race, and this safeguards freedom of expression. In my closing speech, Presiding Officer, I will certainly address the issues that were raised around the inclusion or the non-inclusion of the sex aggravator, issues that have been raised by Joanne Lamont, Elaine Smith and a number of other members, but I am out of time, and I will simply say this, Presiding Officer, that this bill makes clear that we are listening to the victims of hate crime. You can get that from any of the organisations that represent the many victims of hate crime. This bill has shown, I think, the very best of Parliament this year, and a number of changes have been made. I'm delighted that we have a bill that will strengthen the law to tackle hate crime in a way that protects the rights of everyone to live their lives free of harm, while, of course, protecting the rights to the freedom of expression. I move that the Parliament agrees that the Hate Crime Public Order Scotland Bill be passed.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm sorry, I must be very strict at time. We must go into portfolios at 2:30. Now call Liam Kerr to open the Conservatives. 6 minutes, Mr Kerr.
All noted, Presiding Officer. Today marks the end of a long and tortuous passage for a bill laid almost a year ago. An unprecedented 2,000+ people and groups felt compelled to respond to the request for evidence. Now, I suggested to Parliament last autumn that the sensible thing to do, in light of that, given the responses, the pandemic, the disruption to everyday life, would be to take the bill away, rethink it and come back with something that definitively protected those it sought to, rightly, yet would not attack freedom of speech. Now, only the Scottish Conservatives supported me in that proposition, so the bill progressed. And at the stage 1 debate, I flagged that, notwithstanding the Cabinet Secretary's stated intentions to remove some of the most illiberal and ill-thought-through sections, Part 2, concerning the stirring up offences, remained fundamentally flawed. And despite the extensive amendments at both Stage 2 and yesterday, the hate crime bill is still fundamentally flawed. Now, this is not simply my view. Victim Support Scotland say, in the covering email to their submission, that victims of hate crime in Scotland are relying on MSPs to pass robust legislation that will offer them the protection they need. There are many voices saying that this legislation is neither robust nor will it offer that protection. Indeed, Joanne Lamont and others made powerful contributions yesterday, reminding us there is a whole group of victims of hate crime who are specifically not covered by this bill. There is inherent ambiguity, and that's an issue, because as Savanta Comra's survey shows, 75% of Scots agree that hatred means different things to different people. And so, as Elaine Smith pointed out several times yesterday, does a judgment about what is reasonable. Amnesty International remind us the Scottish Parliament has a duty to ensure that the bill balances protection for freedom of expression with the obligation to prohibit incitement to discrimination, hostility or violence. The bill before us does not strike that balance. It contains a freedom of expression clause which many groups, from many different perspectives, remain unhappy with, despite the Cabinet Secretary's reassurances today. Scott Wortley of Edinburgh University suggests the formulation and structure of the clause could lead to problems with interpretation and precedent. The Law Society say in their briefing note, we also have concerns that the freedom of expression provisions will not now be as easily understood. They lack a degree of clarity and send confusing messages. And earlier this week, Hardeep Singh of the network of Sikh organisations said, if enacted, this bill, will make Scotland one of the most hostile places for freedom of expression in Europe. Wow! Surely, so many voices being raised from so many sides of the political spectrum give us pause for thought. Now, Scott Wortley also suggests criminalisation of hate speech leaves it open for pressure to be put on people through vexatious complaints which take time and energy to defend. Roddy Dunlop QC agrees, tweeting earlier this week, concerns will remain about weaponisation. Only a few weeks ago, the Scottish Police Federation wrote to the Justice Committee convener saying there is substantial potential for many more people coming to adverse police attention as a consequence of elements of this legislation, regardless of potential freedom of expression provisions. And if that is correct, there must be a risk that this bill as presented could have a chilling effect on freedom of expression. Now, furthermore, despite my own and Adam Tompkins' attempts, this bill contains no defence regarding private conversations in your own home. The police could come to your home, having received a report of stirring up hate round the dinner table, and take witness statements from those present. That presumably could include your children. I cannot vote for that, presiding officer, but nor do we need to, because the government's own financial memorandum states that these offences will more accurately define hate crime and adds the conduct in question would already constitute existing criminal offences, such as breach of the peace or threatening or abusive behaviour. Indeed, according to Murray Blackburn Mackenzie, it is not clear how expanding stirring up offences will fill a legislative gap on paper or reduce in practice the number of hate-related attacks on individuals in particular groups. Presiding officer, I remind members of the thoughtful intervention by Neil Findlay yesterday. He said, I think many of us, if we're being honest, believe that there should be hate crime legislation or a form of hate crime legislation, but how it is being done in this bill is not it. He said, I think that many people in the community and in here would want the government to withdraw this bill, come back with properly thought out legislation that carries an overwhelming majority in this place, but also carries the confidence of the people who are victims of hate crime. He's right. And so I ask MSPs this, will Labour really vote for a bill about which Lucy Hunter-Blackburn says the people this will get used against are much more likely to be working class? Will James Kelly really vote for a bill? I really can't, Mr Findlay, I'm sorry. Will James Kelly really vote for a bill that Free to Disagree point out has considerable parallels to the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act? Will the Liberal Democrats really back what many have described as an utterly illiberal bill? And will the SNP back what Jim Stiller said is one of the most pernicious and dangerous pieces of legislation ever produced by any government in modern times? Let me finish with a quote from Hardeep Singh. For ordinary people, there will be a serious chilling effect on free speech. MSPs must therefore put free speech first when making the decisive vote on this ill-conceived legislation. The only way to do that is to vote against it. A decision time tonight, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Conservatives will do just that.
Thank you very much. I now call Neil Bibby to open for Labour. Mr Bibby, please, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Firstly, can I recognise the work of the Justice Committee and in particular the convener Adam Tompkins and those members who participated in the debates on the amending stages of the bill yesterday and over the past few months. Whatever their perspective on each of those amendments, how we test arguments is critical to how the Parliament makes good law. When we are considering fundamental principles of equality, human rights and freedom of expression, that process is crucial. I acknowledge that there is concern about aspects of this bill, and I also want to acknowledge the steps that have been taken to address concerns and make improvements to it. In Scottish Labour, we believe that hate crime should be dealt with using the full force of the law. We made a promise in our manifesto to take a zero-tolerance approach to hate crime. We believe the law can and should be strengthened, and we have been engaging with stakeholders and other parties to find agreement on how to do it. Crimes rooted in prejudice and hatred of another based on any of the protected characteristics should offend and alarm us all. Victims should feel confident they can come forward and that it will make a difference. We know there's been an increase in the number of hate crime charges in recent years, and there are a range of factors for this. Further analysis is clearly essential, and that's why we welcome the new reporting obligations. Nevertheless, what we do know from evidence is that a lack of clarity around hate crime legislation disadvantages the victim. It's important to remember what Lord Bracadale's review found. That review found confusion about what a hate crime is. That review found language that was difficult to understand and a lack of clarity on what sort of behaviour makes something a hate crime. So in that context, it therefore makes sense that we should seek to consolidate, modernise and reform Scotland's hate crime laws. We need this bill because hate crime itself has become more widespread. Society has become more polarised and divided. All of us can see how raw and unpleasant some aspects of political debate have become and how easily hate can rear its head. While social media has given old hatreds a new platform, we must remember that in truth, prejudice and hatred in this country never went away. Scotland is no different to the rest of the UK and no different to many other countries in this regard. At times it feels that the more we have advocated tolerance, the less tolerance there appears to be. This bill is necessary to ensure there is accountability and prevent unacceptable ill will and malice. The corrosive idea that someone needs to be blamed for societal problems has seen the most excluded and underrepresented members of society targeted and become victims of crime. This cannot be allowed to continue. Presiding Officer, as we debated yesterday, Scottish Labour believe the protected characteristic of sex should have been included as an aggravator in the bill. It is deeply regrettable that it is not, because it's clear that women are subjected to hate because of their sex. We believe the bill is flawed because of this. We want to see this gap addressed as soon as possible. We note that the enabling legislation will, along with a commitment from the Cabinet Secretary on timescales, make sex a protected characteristic quicker than bringing forward a totally new piece of legislation. We will therefore follow the work of Baroness Kennedy's working group closely. Finally, Presiding Officer, this bill's long journey to stage 3 has caused controversy. A bill that is aimed to provide clarity had to be constantly clarified. A bill to consolidate hate crime laws has at times consolidated opposition from the unlikeliest of partners. When it was originally introduced, the bill was deeply flawed, but as the Cabinet Secretary said throughout its progress, Parliament has tackled many of those problems and strengthened its protections. We still believe there are flaws, and those flaws are on the government. But ultimately, we also have to recognise that this bill will give important protections to minorities who will welcome it. The government have given assurances that they will now make this legislation work, and we will hold them to those assurances with post-legislative scrutiny. Scottish Labour will vote for this bill as amended, but before we do, we have to reflect on how much more must be done to tackle prejudice and hate in Scotland. It cannot be legislated out of existence. Presiding Officer, any action we take today must come alongside wider societal change in our communities and in our workplaces and an agenda for inclusion and education that tackles the prejudice we are united against today.
Thank you very much, Mr Bibby. I now call Liam MacArthur to open for the Liberal Democrats. Mr MacArthur, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I start again by commending Parliament for the rigorous and passionate way in which it conducted its scrutiny of Stage 3 last night. It was, as some said, Parliament at its best. At times, colleagues clearly found some of what was said uncomfortable, unsettling, and on occasion deeply offensive. That, as we know, is in the nature of the debate we were having. But I do not believe it could credibly be argued that any of what was said in relation to any of the amendments we considered last night was either hateful or constituted hate speech. It's invidious to pick out individuals, but let me pay tribute to Joanne Lamont for the force and conviction with which she argued her case. Whether or not you agree with her, hers is a voice that commands respect and underlines what will be lost with her departure. So too Adam Tompkins, whose articulation of the arguments around freedom of expression was one of the best speeches I've heard in this chamber. Enough indeed for me to forgive him his intellectual contortion that saw him declare Joanne Lamont and Joan McAlpine's amendments unnecessary before then promptly voting for them. Deputy Presiding Officer, last summer this was not a bill Scottish Liberal Democrats could support, not because we didn't believe modernising and consolidating hate crime laws was unnecessary. One only has to look at the rise in hate crime across all characteristics to see the need to give our police, prosecutors and courts the tools they require. But we shared the concerns of many, including faith groups, academics, the police, law society, actors, journalists and others about the drafting of the bill. A mix of vague language and expanded criminality saw the Justice Secretary himself accused of his own stirring up offence. To his credit, Mr Youssef heeded the calls from myself and others to make the stirring up offences intent only, and he also sensibly agreed to a reasonableness test. Even so, concerns remained over the balance being struck between protecting those at risk of hate speech and safeguarding our fundamental right to freedom of expression. As our convener was fond of reminding us, rights such as freedom of speech and privacy should be interpreted and applied generously, and restrictions legislated for narrowly and only where necessary in the public interest. Those rights and freedoms are not unfettered, of course, but as the oft-quoted Lord Justice Headley reminds us, freedom only to speak inoffensively is not worth having. How to strike an appropriate balance isn't easy. Some will argue it hasn't been achieved, but I disagree. We now have broad and consistent freedom of expression protections across all new characteristics, with the exception of religion, where faith groups, the Humanist Society and others were almost unanimous in calling for more specific protections. I recognise the rationale for making a distinction between the approach we take to debate around ideas and beliefs on the one hand and an individual's innate identity on the other. Let's be clear, no one, absolutely no one, should be required to hold any particular belief or express views to suggest that they do. However, nor should they be permitted to act in ways that to any reasonable person would be considered threatening or abusive and with the intention of stirring up hatred. So I welcome the combined change introduced courtesy of the Cabinet Secretary's amendment and Adam Tompkins' specific reference to ECHR. Together, these do indeed broaden and deepen the protections afforded. Deputy Presiding Officer, before closing, I want briefly to reflect on the non-inclusion of the sex aggravator. Looking back at my remarks at stage 1, I'm reminded that I found myself largely in agreement with Joanne Lamont. It seemed anomalous to leave out the characteristic of sex, given Lord Bracadale's recommendation, and the risk of laws subsequently being passed without proper parliamentary scrutiny. I confess those concerns have not wholly disappeared. Ultimately, though, I was persuaded, on balance, by the evidence the committee heard from Scottish Women's Aid, Rape Crisis Scotland, Engender,
the member must wind up completely,
and Zero Tolerance, that this matter would benefit from the expertise of Dame Helena Kennedy's working group. Time will tell whether that is the right approach. Presiding Officer, all the evidence is that societies and economies are stronger when every person can contribute, and that means stopping the discrimination that rules many people out of living their lives to the full. There should be equal opportunity for everyone, no matter what we look like, who we are or where we come from. And on that basis, Scottish Liberal Democrats will be supporting the bill this evening.
Thank you very much, Ms MacArthur. Now call on John Finney to open for the Green Party. Mr Finney, 4 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. And can I start by thanking everyone who's got us to this point, Lord Bracadale, the Cabinet Secretary and his team, Our convener, the Justice Convener, Adam Tompkins, whose leadership throughout this has been very, very helpful in steering us with important issues, freedom of speech, the threshold to trigger the offence, referred to by one of the previous speakers as safeguards, our committee witnesses, and as ever, our staff. Lord Bracadale stated in his review, hate crime is a term to describe behaviour which is both criminal and rooted in prejudice. But of course we know hate crime is about people, it's not about statistics. And sadly, the public scrutiny of this bill has exposed deep-seated prejudice which simply can't be allowed to prevail. One of the policy objectives of the bill was that it would be user-friendly, perhaps not about the precise wording of the legislation, more about the public discourse about the purpose and effect of the law. And I think training is important, and I have confidence in our police and the OPFS when it comes to that. We can't forget Tories simply wanted to prevent the updating of the statutory response to hate crime, but to turn the clock back and remove existing protections. Tories wanting to make Scotland have weaker laws in respect of stirring up racial hatred than other jurisdictions in the UK. We've also seen some shameful misrepresentation suggesting the bill had zero regard for freedom of expression, suggesting family meals would be ruined by a flurry of arrests by police officers. Crass nonsense. And we had amendments which displayed a gross indifference to those who don't conform to narrow prejudices, and not just from the Tories. Amendments which would have shamefully airbrushed intersex people from existence. Amendments which would have undermined the existing protections for transgender people, which have been in place since 2004. The bill, like others, is about balancing human rights, and I think the balance between the freedom of expression and the right to private life has been struck with this bill, and countless organisations agree. George W. Bush Jr. once challenged the world, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists, and that's the approach that was taken by many in this debate. So, Presiding Officer, perhaps I would like to lay out very clearly where the Scottish Green Party are on these issues. We are with those who respect freedom of expression and understand its limits. We are with those across the globe seeking to tackle the on-rising hate crime. We are with those who harm no one and only want to be themselves. We are with those that want their communities to be rid of the scourge of hate crime. We are with sound parliamentary scrutiny and making good laws. And we won't be bullied by those with mild-sounding social media names and poisonous agendas. We will stand with those who are abused because of the colour of their skin or their disability. We will stand with those who are subjected to physical and hateful verbal attacks from whatever quarter. We'll stand with the LGBT people, knowing they consider hate crime one of their biggest concerns. Presiding Officer, the One Scotland website promotes a Scotland, and I quote here, that believes in equality for all. No one should be denied opportunities because of age, disability, gender identity, race, religion or belief, or sexual orientation. It's certainly my belief that this bill will play a part in the delivery of that entirely realistic goal. And I hope that after all that this bill has been through, it receives parliamentary backing. Certainly at decision time tonight, the Scottish Green Party will be supporting this bill. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr Finney. Open debate, 4-minute speeches. Rona Mackay, followed by Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We've reached the final stage of a bill which has generated more attention from the public and in the media than any other piece of legislation during my time as an elected representative. At the outset, as Deputy Convener of the Justice Committee, can I too thank the many witnesses who gave expert advice, the Bill team and as ever our outstanding clerking team and SPICE for working so hard on this monumental task. During this session of Parliament, we've passed important groundbreaking legislation on many issues, some of which I was involved in, some which I was not. But I'm very pleased to have been involved in the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill, despite its high profile and often heated nature. Because, Presiding Officer, if passed at decision time tonight, this legislation will send a message to those who stir up hatred with intent to threaten and abuse minority groups that their behaviour has no place in Scotland. Yes.
Joanne Lamont.
I wonder, it's a regret to you that at 5 p.m. this evening there will be no signal being sent out about the hate crime that women face day and daily?
I'm afraid, Ms Mackay, can't give you extra time. You'll still have to absorb it in your 4 minutes. Please continue.
Yeah, I will come to that in my speech, if you just let me proceed. So who could argue with that? Protecting minority groups. The bill consolidates and modernises existing hate crime legislation following the hate crime review undertaken by Lord Bracadale, for which there was cross-party support in June 2018. Presiding Officer, the attention given to the bill has brought home the importance of freedom of expression and why it must be protected. I fully understand the concerns in this regard. However, the freedom of expression amendments passed yesterday, and in particular Adam Tompkins' Amendment 1, should reassure people that this bill does not stifle discussion, opinion or challenging views. We witnessed that in the very passionate debate held in the Chamber last night. So can I thank Adam Tompkins for submitting Amendment 1 and for the consensual way he steered the committee through the bill as convener. And can I echo his comments from yesterday about the intensive scrutiny this issue of the bill and the bill in general has been under. I'm just sorry the Tories have said they won't be supporting it tonight. I'd also like to thank the Cabinet Secretary for his willingness to engage at every level of this bill. Sorry, I don't have time, sorry. Not just with the committee, but with an extensive range of stakeholders to take their advice and listen to their views. It's crucial to remember that there's a reasonable person defence and a very high bar before conduct is criminalised. All alleged offences have to be proved beyond reasonable doubt in court. Of course, some people will say the amendments passed yesterday go too far, some not far enough. This is a very subjective issue. We know that hate crimes are on the rise, they threaten community cohesion and are an extremely distressing and pernicious form of criminality, ruining lives with their cruelty and endangering lives. Presiding Officer, the fact that minority ethnic groups experience 2/3 of all race-related hate crimes shows we have much more to do to overcome prejudice. For that reason, the Cabinet Secretary was persuaded it wasn't necessary or appropriate to include race within the freedom of expression provision, as among other unintended consequences, it would leave Scotland with less protection than the rest of the UK, and I fully support that decision. Presiding Officer, there is a clear need to tackle misogyny and gender-based prejudice in Scotland. And I have a lot of sympathy with Joanne Lamont's amendments, and I do admire the passionate manner in which she's articulated them and fought for women's rights over many years. But I disagree with her for all the reasons outlined yesterday by my colleague Annabel Ewing. Systemic misogyny needs more than a sex aggravator. All measures in the past to tackle misogyny haven't worked. The fact that the government has set up the Misogyny and Criminal Justice in Scotland Working Group, to be led by Helena Kennedy, is testament to the overriding importance we put in tackling this issue. It's time to tackle misogyny once and for all.
I'm afraid you must conclude.
It's time to tackle misogyny once and for all, and I firmly believe we should let the group do this important work and come to its conclusions.
No, sorry, thank you. You must stop now. I'm taking no pleasure in doing this, but the timetable's been set by the Bureau and I must keep to it. So please accept my apologies chairing this. I do wish I could give you more time, but I can't. I'll now take Murdo Fraser, followed by Joanne Lamont.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. One of the most disappointing aspects of the debate around this bill is that it often gets lost, that there's much in this bill with which everyone can agree. So we would all agree that hate crime should be deplored. We would all agree that it makes sense to consolidate the existing law around aggravators. And we would all agree that the blasphemy law is a historical anachronism which should be removed from the statute book. But the debate around this bill has concentrated on Part 2 and the creation of new stirring up offences. And it is no surprise that we have seen heavily divided opinion around Part 2, with a broad coalition of voices being raised against what the Scottish Government is proposing. And so we've seen faith groups, secularists, human rights campaigners, writers, comedians, academics, all expressing serious concern around the impact on free speech from what is being proposed. We know that there are those who want to use law to close down debate. We saw that in the course of the debate yesterday afternoon. There's no more current example of that issue than the dispute between trans activists and feminists over the definition of what is a woman or the need to protect women's spaces. And there's a real concern that the legislation we pass today will be weaponised by those who want to close down debate, who want to silence those who simply take a different view. And we heard a flavour of that in the debate yesterday afternoon in what was a chilling contribution by Patrick Harvey in response to a series of speeches by women MSPs raising their legitimate concerns about issues in this bill, which he seems to suggest verged on the hateful. I think we have to be extremely careful when we proceed with this bill. It is only by debating ideas, by robustly challenging each other, that society is able to advance and reform is achieved. I think Liam MacArthur said a few moments ago that there is no need for legislation to defend popular opinions. It is opinions which are unpopular that need to be protected. And substantial concerns remain as to the impact that this bill will have on those expressing views not held to be part of the mainstream. And it seems to me extraordinary that we've got in a position that following the rejection of Joanne Lamont's amendments yesterday, this bill now gives more protection to men who dress as women than it does to women themselves. Now, I recognise that the Justice Secretary has gone to lengths to try and improve this bill. I would pay tribute to the excellent work done by my good friend Adam Tompkins and his colleagues on the Justice Committee in terms of the detailed scrutiny at stage 2. But we have seen the Justice Secretary running around just within the last few weeks, convening sessions with stakeholders to try and reach agreement on the terms of free speech amendments to this bill, amendments which were brought forward for debate just yesterday with just a few days for external consultation and public scrutiny. That is not the way that legislation, particularly legislation that creates new criminal offences, should be introduced. There is a broader debate about how this Parliament functions and how it can best hold the executive to account. We have no revising chamber to act as a check on what we might vote for in here. The Justice Committee has done an excellent job with a very strong convener, but even its role is limited after the bill passage from stage 2. It seems to me that this is no way to make law. What I would like to have seen is for the Scottish Government to withdraw part 2 of this bill in its entirety, as Liam Kerr suggested. We would then have had unanimity around passing parts 1 and 3 and got good legislation onto the statute book, and then we could have taken back part 2 in a separate piece of legislation in the next Parliament with time to properly build consensus. Instead, we're rushing ahead, publishing legislation which may well have deeply damaging unintended consequences, and that is not something I could support. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Joanne Lamont, to be followed by Shona Robertson. Ms Robertson is the last speaker in the open debate.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I will bow to your discipline. I'm not convinced that my own speech will be as disciplined as it should be, so if I don't manage to finish it, please believe me that this is a debate that will continue. I hear people have said that this is a good debate. From where I sit, it may have been interesting, but if you don't win the argument, what is left behind is a sense of grave, I have to say, grave disappointment that I couldn't persuade the chamber. And I don't think that the people who disagreed with me believe that women shouldn't be protected. I don't make that case. But I do think we made the wrong decision yesterday. And as someone committed to equality all of my life, I regret very much that I will not be able to vote for this bill at the end of the day. And I hope that nobody in this chamber or anywhere else takes that as meaning that I want anybody in our communities to face hate, disadvantage or abuse. It is not for that reason, but it is because this bill does not address a fundamental problem. In real time, as we were debating this legislation yesterday, we were hearing on the news of yet another victim of male violence. And in real time, women were taken to social media to describe what we do every day to keep ourselves safe, whether we're walking in a park or running or getting a bus. That is the reality of women's lives, and that is the reality that is not being addressed in this bill. And instead, I was subjected again today to a lecture about how I don't care enough, that women don't care enough about people who are the victims of abuse. I am told that denying a cross-dresser the protection of this bill is unacceptable. And I say this, we know that cross-dressers, even Tim Hopkins himself, said it was a lifestyle choice, not a matter of identity. And it was a problem that could have been solved by including women in this legislation. And I'm not saying that the sex aggravator would solve everything. We are women. We know that signals are not enough, but it would have been a starting point for the work that the working group would do. And we could not even agree on a definition of what sex is. And this matters because the truth is that there is now a live debate about whether in fact there is two sexes or not. And I respect all sides of that debate, but I have to tell John Finney the term intersex is offensive to many people in the communities who suffer from difference in sexual characteristics. They do not regard themselves as intersex. But actually, the more important point is this. If people believe that there are more than two sexes, if they want to change the law, then change the law. Make the argument. But in the world I inhabit, you don't both argue a position which is at odds with the law, and might I say the science, and resist having that debate in public and making a decision, and denounce those without changing the law who state what the current law is. That is why the amendment on defining what sex mattered so much. It's not a matter for the working group to define that. It's a matter for us coming together and having that debate as a community and as a society. And I also recognise the deep-held views of the Cabinet Secretary and his experience. I do not diminish it one bit. I do not diminish anyone who suffers disadvantage because of where they find themselves. But I plead with him, if it is reasonable to pause on women, why are we not pausing on these other complex areas? It cannot be that you will argue both. We can wait a year for women who we know today are experiencing violence or dealing with abuse precisely because of their sex, but that we can't wait, and that those who will not vote for the bill will be guilty of encouraging racism and disadvantage. Those two things are not possible to argue at the same time. And I say this in conclusion. What is behind this? We're dancing on all sorts of arguments here, but what is behind this is that in our communities now, people face discrimination, disadvantage, abuse, and women are part of that. And there are other folk who understand what that is like. And this bill will fail if we do not go beyond sending signals. I regret very much it won't even signal support for women. But if we settle for the signal, we will not be doing the heavy lifting of what government is actually about, which is educating, challenging, supporting, working with people in our communities that they might come together and making real, in law, our aspiration to a fairer Scotland. I regret very much that at the end of the day, when I vote with my absolute conviction today that this bill does not address these problems, I have no doubt that I will be characterised as someone full of hate. Please believe me that the women who want this legislation to be changed, those who have highlighted their concerns, aspire to the same as those who will vote for it. But we have to wrestle with the fact that even as a signal, this legislation does not even address the lived experience of the women in this place. It's not good enough. I am sorry, and I regret being so forthright to tell me that I spoke well. Women have spoken well through the generations, and they are speaking now, and they are telling you what their lived experience is. This Parliament needs to tackle these problems. They need to tackle the argument that is at dispute and is highly contentious, not hide it away and denounce those who are not prepared to go along with that. I respect everyone in this chamber. I trust they will respect the women in this chamber and beyond this chamber who continue to say this is not good enough. We need to think again, get our heads around the complexities of it and get legislation that genuinely protects all of those who experience hatred, disadvantage and abuse simply for being who they are.
Thank you, Ms Lamont. And I know members will understand why I extended the time for Ms Lamont, but the rest of you, no. So, Shona Robertson, please, to closing speeches.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And I, for one, will support Joanne Lamont's position on this and would certainly support her right, for the good reasons that she set out, not to vote for this bill. And I would certainly support her if she is attacked in any way for that, because I don't believe for a second that Joanne Lamont is against this bill for any other reason. So I just wanted to put that on the record. This bill has, without a doubt, been on a journey, and those of us on the Justice Committee have spent many hours looking at this bill and trying to work together to improve it. And I think we have made significant progress on that. The law, as been said before, has protected people from anyone stirring up racial hatred against them due to their race for decades. And this bill, of course, now extends that protection to people in relation to other characteristics and is supported by dozens of organisations who support the victims of hate crime. The consensus that has brought us to this point, I think, has been down to the government listening to the concerns that has been raised and making changes to address those concerns. Further changes being agreed yesterday. The concerns over freedom of expression were raised, listened to and acted upon to ensure that any successful prosecution for the new offences must prove that the person intended to stir up hatred and, of course, includes the reasonable person test to ensure that an objective test is applied. It is a high threshold, and I think the further strengthening of freedom of expression clauses yesterday from Adam Tompkins strengthens that further. So we now have very strong freedom of expression protections, and that is right. The Justice Committee, in its job of scrutinising the bill, has taken extensive evidence on all matters relating to this bill, and I think it now does strike the right balance between protecting groups targeted by hate crime and respecting people's rights to freedom of speech. And as many of us in the committee wrestled with, that is not an easy balance to strike, not an easy balance at all. I think we've got to the best place that we possibly could have. This debate has been dominated by the debate over whether to include a sex aggravator at this stage. And I thought Annabel Ewing's contribution yesterday summed matters up rather well, and I agree with her. And it's not just a number of women's organisations raised concerns about the inclusion of a sex aggravator at this stage for the reasons that are well rehearsed. But the events of recent days do remind us of the deep-rooted misogyny and male violence in our society. And I would hope, along with Joanne Lamont, that we can all agree on what we want to see happen in terms of the changes in our society. We may disagree on some of the processes to get there, and obviously we disagree on the aspect of this bill. But I think what unites us, Joanne, is the fact that we can paint a picture together that wouldn't differ very much of the type of society we want to see. So the working group, and it's not just about the working group, but I do think the working group has a job to do to make sure, not just looking at whether a sex aggravator should be added to this bill at a later stage. I'd like to see that group take a root and branch investigation of what more can be done to tackle misogyny in our society, whether that's through legislation, policy, education, or cultural change and societal change. Not just that working group, but I'd like to think all of us have a job to put that centre stage of the work of the next Parliament, and with allies outside this Parliament who I'm sure will continue to work hard on that as well. And I hope we can unite on that, if nothing else.
Thank you very much, Ms Robertson. Closing speeches. James Kelly, closing for Labour, please. Mr Kelly.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. As Neil Bibby and Liam MacArthur said, unfortunately, hate crime is on the rise in Scotland. And from that point of view, robust laws to tackle hate crime are welcome. I think it's important to examine the advent of this bill, the process that's gone through, and why we've ended up in a situation where, even at this stage, some of the elements of it are deeply contested. The Brackendale review was basically the root of the birth of the bill, and when that was published, everyone agreed cross-party that there was a need for hate crime legislation that brought all the laws into the one place, made it more efficient, and made the law operate better and gave adequate protection to victims of hate crime. The reality is that once the bill was published, the drafting in it was at best clumsy and at worst incompetent. And that resulted in a host of organisations being particularly critical of Part 2 of the bill. We saw the situation where the clauses around theatre performances had to be withdrawn. There was a whole controversy around stirring up hatred and the use of the phrase, likely to stir up hatred. And that was widely criticised for the lack of interpretation around that. And that was taken off. So there had to be withdrawals. There have been some amendments to improve things. But a reflection on the debate last night, I thought it was a very high quality debate. There was a lot of strong speeches from across the chamber. But it struck me that in a number of amendments, there was still, a lot of MSPs were still unclear about the interpretation of the law. And that strikes me that, there remain issues with this legislation. And I think that there's going to be a crucial role going forward as this legislation is passed and it goes into the courts. The test will be whether sheriffs and the legal practitioners and the police can adequately interpret this law so that it can be used properly in the courts. And therefore, I think there's going to be a really crucial role for the Parliament in terms of post-legislative scrutiny, because a lot of the aspects of the bill are going to have to be looked at closely in operation. And if it is the case that it's not operating correctly, then this will need to be revisited in the next session of the Parliament. And I would hope that the Government and the Cabinet Secretary would accept that. I think Joanne Lamont, in what was a very strongly principled and conviction speech, was right when she said that legislation on its own isn't enough. Signals aren't enough. There's a lot that needs to be done in terms of education, working in communities, changing culture to ensure that those who are currently the victims of hateful abuse get proper protection, not just in law, but in society in general. So there's a big task here. Scottish Labour will support this legislation at decision time, but let's be clear, it's not perfect and there's much work to be done, not just to make this legislation work, but to tackle hate crime robustly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Adam Tompkins to close for the Conservatives. Mr Tompkins, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I start by thanking Liam MacArthur, John Finney and Rona Mackay for their kind and generous remarks. Presiding Officer, the Hate Crime Bill is a much changed piece of legislation when compared with the bill that we first debated here in this chamber last September. On that occasion, my Conservative colleagues sought to have Part 2 of the bill, the provisions that concern the stirring up offences, removed from the bill entirely, on the basis that they constituted an unwarranted and dangerous attack on freedom of expression. The Conservative motion, rightly or wrongly, was heavily defeated, and ever since then it has been clear that this bill would pass, despite all the many criticisms it has attracted and continues to attract from lawyers, from faith groups, from campaigners, and especially from women. In the months since then, all my work on this bill has been designed to try and address those criticisms and to fix this bill. I wanted this Parliament to learn the lessons of the Named Persons legislation and of the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act, and not to repeat the experience of legislating in a way that breaches and that fails to respect our fundamental rights. Presiding Officer, so significantly and substantially amended is the Hate Crime Bill that it is no longer the grave threat to freedom of speech that it once was. First, the stirring up offences, other than as regards race, can now be committed only when the accused intends to stir up hatred. Second, offences about theatres and public performances and possession of inflammatory material have been removed from the bill entirely. Third, we've clarified on the face of the bill that behaviour or speech is threatening or abusive only when a reasonable person would consider it to be threatening or abusive. Fourth, we've said in terms that mere discussion or criticism of matters relating to the protected characteristics is not to be taken as threatening or abusive. And fifth, we've emphasised that just because someone feels offended or shocked or disturbed by what is said does not mean that the criminal threshold has been crossed. But, Presiding Officer, even these changes, welcome and essential as they all are, have not quelled the very real fear that continues to stalk this land because of this bill. As we heard yesterday, in terms as passionate and dignified and compelling as anything I've ever heard in this chamber, people are afraid, in particular women, and that this bill has induced such fear in the women of this country should make us all pause. Now, I hope that we have done enough to ensure that women's fears about this bill are not realised in practice. But that will depend now not on the words we've written into the law, but on the training we give to our police officers and prosecutors, and on the way we explain this legislation to the public. In particular, it must be widely understood that just because you are offended or hurt or upset by something that someone has said about an aspect of your identity does not mean that a hate crime has been committed. Presiding Officer, even if this bill does not pose the grave risk to free speech that it once did, the same cannot be said for the equally worrying threat that this bill continues to pose for privacy and for private and family life. We have tried, Presiding Officer, Conservative amendments at both stage 2 and again yesterday at stage 3 did try to bring this bill into line with the way in which public order offences should respect the right to private and family life. But we have been thwarted, outvoted. I wish I could say that this bill poses no threat to private and family life. But because I cannot say that, I cannot and will not vote for this bill at decision time today. Even now, even as amended, even after all the work we've done, this bill continues to pose a real risk to our fundamental rights and liberties, a risk which this Parliament should not be taking. Personally, Presiding Officer, this is a matter of deep regret. I don't want to live in a Scotland where people are free to threaten or abuse one another, intending to stir up hatred. But when legislating in this or indeed any other area, Parliament must ensure that its legislation respects and does not infringe our human rights. And it is a matter of real regret to me that this bill does not meet that test. But that is why I will vote against it at decision time today.
Thank you very much, Mr Tompkins. I now call Humza Yousaf to close the Scottish Government. Cabinet Secretary, please, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Thank you to members of across the Chamber for their very thoughtful speeches. My thanks again to the Justice Committee, to the clerks, to the Scottish Government team and others who have worked so hard on this bill, and the stakeholders, of course. I thought I would use that maxim that I've often quoted in the Chamber, that I think all legislators should really have at the forefront of their mind. And many of us have referenced it in other ways. What is about us without us is not for us. And what I would say to Liam Kerr, and I will come to the point about women shortly, what I would say to Liam Kerr is that he should listen to the voices of victims' organisations that represent victims who believe that this bill is absolutely necessary. Victim Support Scotland, who he quoted, support the bill. In fact, they say, and I quote directly, if this bill is not allowed to proceed through Parliament, it may be years before victims of hate crime have another chance to be given the protection they deserve. No, I will not. You forgive me, you've got some extra time. I have only a few minutes to close this debate. The Equality Network, Stonewall Scotland, Muslim Council of Scotland, Scottish Council of Jewish Communities, many other organisations, Sikhs in Scotland, the organisation that represents Sikhs here in Scotland, support the bill. Many other organisations, racial equality organisations, all support the bill. And when it comes, of course, to the issues that are raised by Joanne Lamont and many other speakers as well, it's not that I doubt Joanne Lamont's sincerity to tackle hatred. I've said that from the very beginning and put that on record. My concern with Joanne Lamont's statement is that she does not adequately recognise that there are a number of other women who, again, are very ably represented by organisations such as Scottish Women's Aid, by Rape Crisis Scotland, by Engender Scotland, by Zero Tolerance Scotland, who all say that the addition of a sex aggravator could do harm from women. I completely accept that is not Joanne Lamont's view, that is not Elaine Smith's view, that is not Joan McAlpine's view. I completely accept that. But there is an opposing view. To say that her view is the only one that is represented by women is clearly not the case, because we've heard from Annabel Ewing, from Shona Robinson, as well as the organisations I represent. And people like Dr. Marsha Scott, like Sandy Brindley, like Emma Rich, they are, of course, also, like Joanne Lamont, lifelong feminists. And they have a divergent view. And therefore, the argument being proposed, which has been accepted by the Justice Committee, is that a working group led again by a lifelong feminist and human rights campaigner, Baroness Helena Kennedy, to explore these issues is the right thing to do. And I don't have an in-principle objection to a sex aggravator. If the recommendation is to include it, it will be included. Not only that, I have said and committed on the public record and written to every MSP that a draft order will be published within a month. And that, the acceptance of that divergent view, I think is extraordinarily important. My concern about the Tories' approach to the bill is that, of course, if we enacted their suggested amendments yesterday, the removal of stirring up of hatred offences, we would have the weakest, by far the weakest protections for those who are vulnerable and targets of hatred than anywhere else in the United Kingdom. And the member may shake his head, but that is the fact. We would have the weakest laws to protect minorities. As for Adam Tompkins, and I do include myself and align myself with the members who have praised his handling of the bill as Justice Committee convener. He won't put that in an election leaflet. He won't have to, because he is departing from this place. But I hope he can take pride in the role that he has played, I think, to improve this bill. But the trouble I have with this argument about privacy, of course, and I'm sure he accepts this, it is not an unfettered right. I have Article 8 of the ECHR in front of me. That is the article in the right to respect for private and family life. Part 1 of that article, Article 8, says everyone has the right to respect for his private and family life, his home and his correspondence. Correct. Part 2, there shall be no interference by a public authority with the exercise of this right, except such as is in accordance with the law and is necessary in a democratic society in the interest of national security, public safety, the economic well-being of the country, for the prevention of disorder or crime, for the protection of health or morals, or for the protection of the rights and the freedoms of others. And that is vitally crucial. Because yes, we respect, and of course we have to be compatible with ECHR and all of its articles, including Article 8. But so too we must respect the rights of those who are vulnerable to hate. So let me say this, that we have a duty in this Parliament, all of us accept it, to be a voice for the voiceless, those who are too often left in the margins, in the sidelines, who don't have anybody to speak for them. So to every Jewish person that has suffered anti-Semitism, this bill is for you, and we are your voice. To every black person that has been called the N-word, we are your voice, and this bill protects you. To every lesbian, gay and bisexual person who was threatened simply because of who you love, then this bill is for you, and we are that voice. To every person with a disability mocked when getting on and off public transport or getting on with their everyday lives, then we are your voice, and this bill is for you. To every person in the transgender community attacked for simply being who you are, then this bill is for you, and we are that voice. And I conclude, Presiding Officer, by saying this, that I only feel disappointment and regret that the Conservatives and some of the Labour MSPs will not be supporting this bill at stage 3, because I know that a number of them do, of course, all of them actually, stand unequivocally against hatred and hate crime. And it was a mere 9 months ago we stood in this chamber, collectively in solidarity, to say that we will do everything we can to tackle hatred. And so therefore it is a disappointment that the Conservatives will not join with the other political parties to send out that strong message. And I will say to the victims of hate crime, this bill will protect you, but also to wider society. Your protections under ECHR, your protection to freedom of expression and speech is also protected by this bill. Today we have listened and we have acted, and I commend this bill to Parliament.
Thank you very much. Can I thank members for their contributions in what was a very tight, unfortunately quite a tight debate. That concludes the debate on the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill. It's time to move on to the next item of business. There will be a short pause.